Before we move on to the Week 6 match against the New York Giants, I'm going to briefly cover a few things, including Tom Bettis, the middle linebacker that started over Ray Nitschke. Bettis was drafted in the first round by Green Bay as the 5th overall pick in the 1955 NFL Draft. Now, it's easy to say that maybe the Packers made a mistake by initially putting Bettis above Nitschke. However, one has to remember that not every Hall of Famer started off that amazing. Some players enter the NFL as decent, but improve over time and become legends. Not everyone makes an immediate impact. So let's examine the available facts and try to see if the Packers messed up by not starting Nitschke in 1959. First off, Nitschke's rookie year in 1958, at least on paper, provides an interesting metric as he started 8 games, the same number as Tom Bettis. His stats don't immediately stand out as top tier, but they're not terrible either. He had 1 interception and 2 fumble recoveries, but no sacks are listed. That's because the NFL didn't start counting those officially until 1982. Notice that tackles aren't shown either. That's because the league also had an issue with that. For example, if you go to NFL.com, their tally and tackles only goes back to 1970. But Nitschke and Bettis both started 8 games, so the raw numbers are a fair comparison, right? Not necessarily. Nitschke also played in special teams, but it's unclear how many of his 8 starts were for kickoffs or punts only. In the book, Mean on Sunday, a semi-autobiography of Ray Nitschke, co-written by Robert W. Wells, it shows that Nitschke started the first 4 games for the Packers on defense, but was benched after a bad game against the Washington Redskins. So if that is accurate, at least 4 of those 8 games were defensive starts for him. However, I was unable to find if the other half was too. If Nitschke mostly stayed on the bench after that Washington game, it makes his stats more impressive as he was able to do that while being on the field way less. Okay, so we looked at the limited Nitschke stats for 1958, but what about Bettis? Well, he had 0 interceptions, but he also had 2 fumble recoveries. On the Packers official website, hosted by Cliff Crystal, we can see a section where Coach Phil Binkson gave his thoughts on Tom Bettis. Bettis makes a good signal caller. He has good qualities of leadership. He substitutes quickness for size, and of course, he hits with great authority. However, without a record in sacks or tackles, it creates a giant gap where I don't believe it's really fair to say one player was definitely better than the other in 1958. So what about later on? Well, in 1960, Nitschke broke away from Bettis and started to remove doubt on who should be the starter, and he wouldn't have to worry about Bettis after 1961 as he was traded away. Cliff Crystal documents Bettis' thoughts on this trade. I asked for it. I didn't feel Lombardi was giving me a first shot. I'm not going to get into that, but I was glad to get out of there. After the season was over, I just said, I don't feel like staying here. Lombardi wasn't happy, but I had a little altercation with him verbally. So Nitschke would prove himself the better player. However, the question I am asking isn't if he was better in 1960, it's if he was better in 1959. I am inclined to believe the answer is yes, but with so much missing information combined with the available stats we do have on him in 1958, and also the fact he was benched that season due to poor play, then maybe Lombardi giving Bettis the nod wasn't as poor of a choice as it might first appear. Basically, Lombardi probably messed up in 1959 by not placing him above Bettis, but hold off on saying that absolutely was the case. Now on to running back Don McElhinney. Drafted by the Detroit Lions in 1956, he was traded to Green Bay in 1957 as part of a deal that sent Tobin Rote, the former Packers QB, to Detroit. Rote led the Lions to a championship that same year, making the trade seem lopsided in favor of Detroit. This raises the question of how Vince Lombardi would have handled Rote if he had stayed in Green Bay. Rote was a talented and mobile quarterback who amassed over 3,000 yards rushing in his career, but he was also 31 years old in 1959 and had only one winning season, his first with the Lions. Even when he performed well the following year, his team still lost. Also, Rote routinely completed less than 50% of his passes. In fact, leading up to 1959, there had been only one single time where he hit over 50%. This was the exact opposite with Bart Starr, who in his entire time with the NFL would only dip below 50% in one single season, which is 1958. And if that 57 trade doesn't occur, Rote doesn't get a championship, and so that gives you a 31-year-old who routinely hits below 50% and doesn't have a ring. By the time Lombardi came, you could argue that Rote had hit his peak, and so he would look for someone younger with more room for growth. Getting back to Don McElhinney, he wouldn't produce that much at first for the Packers, averaging under 4 yards per carry for 1957 and 1958. However, in Lombardi's first year, things turned around as he averaged 4.9 yards per attempt. Unfortunately for him, the Packers abandoned the three running back formation and subsequently his right halfback position, which would be replaced by adding an extra receiver to the formation, in this case, Roy Dowler. It is not known what would happen if McElhinney had continued to get that regular playing time. His 4.9 yards per carry were in only 47 attempts, so you could argue that some of this was sampling error and that over the course of the season, this figure would naturally drop. For example, he had a 46-yard run and he had so few carries that if you take that play away, it brings his average all the way down to 4.02 yards. And once again, in his previous two seasons, his performance was underwhelming. He would be traded to the Dallas Cowboys in 1960, and in that year, it was noted that his lack of speed was a problem, although I do not know if this was due to an injury. Perhaps he also had the speed issue in 1959. It's unclear, but with Jimmy Taylor in the backfield and Paul Hornung, it was going to be difficult to maintain steady playing time regardless. Now that the stories are out of the way, let's get back to the newspaper accounts. November 2nd, Lombardi met Frank Gifford on the field before the game against the New York Giants. Gifford was out with an injury as mentioned earlier. They had a brief chat, but the details are unknown. Regardless, this was yet another game where despite what may have happened, it was still close at halftime, at least on paper. Lamar McCann had hurt his shoulder against Baltimore, and it showed in this one as the New York Giants beat them 20-3. The Giants' blitz, combined with McCann's inaccuracy, led to the Packers being unable to move the ball as Green Bay punted 8 times. Or at least that's what I thought, because I was basing this off the number of punt returns the Giants had listed on Pro Football Reference, but then I read the newspaper article and saw Green Bay actually had 2 more punts that weren't returned. So Max McGee punted 10 times. 10. This loss dropped the Packers to a 3-3 record and put them behind the 5-1 49ers and 4-2 Colts in the Western Division race. So let's recap this game. The Packers got the opening kickoff, and runs by Carpenter and Hornung took out the Packers 33. Then on first down, McElhinney picked up 3. This is followed by a 6-yard loss by Carpenter and a 5-yard loss by Hornung, forcing Green Bay to punt. It didn't say what type of runs these were, but based on the yardage lost, they were presumably sweeps. The Giants then got the ball, but the Packers defense held. New York got off a 55-yard punt that put the ball on the Packers' 3-yard line. Don McElhinney then fumbled in a slant to the left, and the Giants recovered, leading to Alex Webster running in for the game's first score. In the second quarter, the Giants began their drive at their own 30 and gained 2 first downs, but the defense held as Bobby Dillon batted away a would-be touchdown. After multiple punts, it was obvious McCann wasn't going to be able to move the ball, so he was sent to the bench, but instead of Bart Starr being brought in, Lombardi opted to use Joe Francis. Starr remembered this moment in his book, Starr, My Life in Football, where he wrote, "I worked extremely hard during practice the week prior to the game and had the game plan down cold. McCann didn't appear as though he would be able to play, and I thought the game in New York would give me the chance to prove myself. Although Joe Francis and I divided practice time at quarterback that week, I was sure I would be called on if McCann couldn't answer the bell. So here we have Starr assuming he was Lombardi's number 2 guy, but the way he phrases it, it seems his coach never specifically told him that. Maybe in Lombardi's mind, Joe Francis was always the second stringer, and he didn't want to say because he thought it would be uncomfortable, but I'm more inclined to think he simply hadn't made up his mind yet. And when Francis was brought in during the second quarter, Starr's assumptions would prove false, bringing his morale down to earth. While Francis was able to move the ball into Giants territory, at least in the second period, Francis hit McElhaney for a 23-yard reception. 3 plays later, on a rollout, Francis and McElhaney had another 23-yard connection, and now Green Bay was at the New York 24. This led to a 28-yard field goal by Horning. On the next Giants possession, Summerall missed from 52. Dillon picked up the failed kick and took it to the Green Bay 12. However, a clipping penalty brought it back to their 5. The Packers ended up punting, and when the Giants were able to move the ball, they were able to salvage the drive with Pat Summerall kicking a 49-yarder to expand the Giants' lead. Francis then hit Horning for 20 yards and then passed to Knaffel for 17 more to move it to the New York 27. A Giants tripping penalty gained 10 more yards for Green Bay and a first down at their opponent's 17. 2 runs took it to the 8. On 3rd and inches, Francis spotted McGee in the end zone, but his pass was off. From 15 yards out, Horning then bounced an attempted field goal off the right upright. In spite of all that went wrong, once again, just like in the first 2 losses, the halftime score was close. The Giants got the ball to start the second half and drove 67 yards, aided by an interference penalty. New York had the ball on the Packers' 24 when the flag was thrown against Bobby Freeman, taking the ball to the Green Bay 7. Webster then ran in from 7 out for his second score. Summerall then nailed another 49-yarder. This was Summerall's second field goal from that distance. The kicking game during this time period was terrible compared to modern standards. This is in part due to the league not yet adopting the more efficient soccer style of kicks. To show you just how unusual 2 successful 49-yarders were in 1959, in the entire NFL that year, only one other team hit from at least that distance. Contrast that to 2022, the last completed NFL season as of this recording, and only one single team out of 32 failed to do this. Back to the game. Late in the match, the Packers had a chance to make the score at least a little bit more respectable when Giants quarterback Don Heinrich threw a pass that was batted up in the air and intercepted by Jim Temp on the Giants' 20. Temp took it back to the 8-yard line. However, in the very next play, Jim Taylor, who was finally back from his injury, fumbled and gave the ball right back. The final period ended with New York on top 20-3. Joe Francis, who played most of the game, had these stats: 5 out of 18 for 91 yards, no touchdowns, and an interception. Lamar McCann, in limited playing time, put up this: 2 out of 8 for 21 yards, no touchdowns, and no interceptions. On the ground, not much was done. Paul Horning had 11 carries for 36 yards and also caught 1 pass for 19. The receiving game was nothing to really speak of, with Don McElhaney leading everyone with 3 catches for 54 yards. He also rushed 5 times for 11. In the postgame, Lombardi said, "We were just overpowered on offense. We couldn't move." On the topic of McCann and his shoulder injury, Lombardi commented, "I never should have started him." On this match, Bart Starr wrote, "While the Packers absorbed a 20-3 thrashing, I stood on the sidelines feeling unwanted and betrayed." He continued, "With me on the sideline was our talented tight end Ron Kramer, who was also held out of the game and equally dejected. It's one thing to get turned down, and it's another to be convinced you had a shot and then to have the rug pulled out from under you completely. The only thing worse than not being needed is not being needed and yet thinking you are. After it was all over, since it was announced the Packers were going to stay in New York that night, Starr and Ron Kramer decided to drown their sorrows together in the city. I'll give you Starr's word and then Ron Kramer's side of the story. Starr writes, I don't remember where we went that night or how many bars we went to. I don't know how much I drank or what I drank, and I don't recall returning to the hotel. Fortunately, Ron was big and strong enough to carry me back. In the David Marinus book, When Pride Still Mattered, it gives Ron Kramer's account. Bart had 4 beers, Miller High Lifes. It was the last time anyone saw him like that. As funny as Ron Kramer's contradiction is, I'm inclined to believe Starr had more to drink than just 4 Miller High Lifes. For one, while a player's weight can fluctuate throughout a career, Pro Football Reference lists Starr as being 197 pounds. And Starr mentioned possibly going to more than one place. And he suffered at least some memory loss. At around 200 pounds, even if he drank those very quickly, one after the other, and made himself noticeably under the influence, that's not normally enough alcohol at his weight to make him partially black out. Maybe in addition to those beers, he also had a shot or two, but who knows. It's interesting to see that despite the final score and the offense being anemic aside for the second quarter, if things had gone slightly different due to the missed field goal and Taylor's fumble in the red zone, the final score could have been 20-9 or even 20-13, and this was against the Giants, the best team in the East, in a game where the Packers starting quarterback was injured. On the other hand, Summerall missed 2 kicks in this game, so it could have been as worse as 26-3, so there must have been mixed feelings. During this time period, Jerry Kramer wrote that despite this mid-season slide, Lombardi was as angry as you might first imagine, and he was actually tougher on the team when they were winning. From what I've read about Lombardi, I know he could change his strategy and how tough he was based on the person and situation, and maybe he felt if he went too hard on the team during the slump, that could backfire, but that's speculation on my part. November 3rd. The paper took the glass is half full approach by talking up the defense. It also mentioned the return of running back Jimmy Taylor, who had lost 10 pounds during his absence. He didn't do much in this game, but he was expected to improve and regain his form. The quarterback situation was unclear. Joe Francis led the Packers into Giants territory twice in the first half, but Green Bay did not name an official backup quarterback. This suggested that Starr might have a chance to play, but they acknowledged that Francis was the more athletic of the two. After looking over pictures of the game, Lombardi said, "We played good enough on defense to win, but they overpowered our offense, forcing us to throw." November 4th. In an effort to deal with the snow, the Packers moved their practice indoors. It doesn't say the full name of the building they were in. They just called it the Arena, which presumably was Brown County Veterans Memorial Arena, which had just opened the year prior in 1958. Lombardi requested use of the facility, and the manager obliged. The players even helped with getting the bleachers out of the way to make space. Henry Nitschke was seen limping as he had hurt his knee in a kickoff in the previous game. The 3-3 Packers would be playing a rematch against the 2-4 Chicago Bears, and if they won, it would be the first time since 1935 that they swept Chicago. The Bears were listed as 7-point favorites. So why were they picked over the Packers, even though Chicago had a worse record? Well, the Packers beat them in a close game that could have gone the other way, and the Bears beat the Rams, a team that had earlier blown out the Packers. Regardless of the outcome, this was going to be a tough road game for Green Bay. Also on November 4th, it gave an update on Lombardi's stolen car. In a previous video, I mentioned 3 juveniles stole it in September of 1959, after his son had parked it at Fremont High School. They got a flat tire and drove it into a ditch. Well, the article provided a few more details. After this, the kids still weren't done, because they then stole a pickup truck out of the Westgate Shopping Center parking lot. This one also ended up in a ditch. The station wagon was then taken from the Oneida Golf and Riding Club. Then they got rid of that, and took an Oldsmobile that was by Country Truck Highway B. No word if the third or fourth vehicles ended up in ditches too. Well, the ringleader of the group, an unnamed 12-year-old, had his day in court where he was sent to St. Joseph's Home for Children. Another child got probation, and the third was released to his parents. I'm not sure why the third got off that easy. November 5th. Art Daly speculated the game might become a rushing battle as the Bears have struggled to pass the ball in all but one game, and Jimmy Taylor was expected to play a bigger role for the Packers than he had the week before. And here we can see Green Bay practicing in the arena the previous day. McCann could be observed at quarterback, about to take a snap. November 6th. Lombardi put a special emphasis on offense during the week, which is not surprising as that was the biggest issue in their last game. McCann's shoulders seemed to be doing better and his throws were improving. And as an interesting historical footnote, Chicago Bears coach George Halas, who was also head of the NFL's expansion committee, met with key members of the American Football League to talk about possibly accepting some teams into the NFL. That's right. Even before the AFL's first season in 1960, the NFL and AFL had a face-to-face meeting, or at least George Halas did, representing the NFL. What's funny about this is both sides had their own version of what transpired. If you ask the AFL, they turned down George Halas, and if you ask Halas, he was the one saying no. So who's telling the truth? I'm inclined to believe it was Halas, since the AFL had more teams than the NFL was comfortable taking on at the moment. If you go by him, he only wanted to add 2 teams, one in Dallas and another in Houston. The Dallas franchise would get picked up, but Houston would later get abandoned, and in its place would be Minnesota. That's all for now. When we continue, despite all the wait, heartache, and frustration, Bart Starr would finally get his chance. See you next time.